Well, thank you for the invitation. My talk I've made it a bit broader than just talking about pluralism. I want to talk about a different approach to economics as well. But I want to start with discussing what is neoclassical economics, because frequently you'll be told whatever definition you have is old-fashioned, out of date, or there's no such thing as neoclassical economics. All sorts of claims I've heard. And I'd say one way I can describe it, it's a chameleon. It changes all the time, and if you actually manage to get a 1960s or 1970s neoclassical economist into a time capsule and move them forward to 2000, they'd barely recognise what is called neoclassical economics today. Because if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, anybody doing a PhD, except me, was making a computable general equilibrium, that's the word I stumble over, computable general equilibrium model, or CGE model of their economy. And that would be a multi-sectoral model. You describe production as involving lots of goods being used to produce lots of goods. And the idea is producing a vector of equilibrium prices and outputs today, not in the future, but the prices as they were today. Micro was important. Everybody believes micro, except anybody who knows something about the real world. So micro foundations were barely discussed, but they were, of course, taken for granted at the same time. And there was a very tenuous link between micro and macro. Today they have what they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. Notice the two words are consistent between the two different approaches, general equilibrium. And they're, rather than being intersectoral or multisectoral, it's intertemporal. The multisectoral approach has almost been abandoned. There's certainly no discussion of the dynamics of that in any of the models that I've seen in there. There'll be one or two, some would do that, but they always have one or two that they can point to. But generally speaking, it's single sectoral, and it's working at a scalar equilibrium output and price trajectory through time. That's general equilibrium now means equilibrium over time, not equilibrium at a point in time for a multi-commodity economy. Micro foundations are crucial, and the link between micro and macro is now direct. So that would be completely foreign to a 1970s neoclassical. But the meta concepts are still there, and especially in microeconomics. And Yanis Varoufakis wrote a paper with Christian Asperger, which I think did a beautiful job of talking about what are the defining characteristics of neoclassical economics, even with all these changes. And the first one they said was methodological individualism. Everything is derived from the individual up. You have to start from the explanation of the individual and then go up to the level of the overall economy. That's one essential precept of neoclassical thought. A second is methodological instrumentalism, and that is that all behaviour is a means for maximising some utility function. Okay? That's, again, tends to be, we change how it's done. It's the prevalent assumption that's what agents in your model are doing, is maximising some preference satisfaction function. And the third is methodological equilibrium, which is one of the main ones I'll focus on today. And Yanis is rather disparaging here, and I'll be the same. He says, they pose the standard question, what behaviour should we expect in equilibrium? The question of whether equilibrium is likely, let alone probable, or how it might materialise, is treated as an optional extra, one that is never central to the neoclassical project. I just recently went through looking at two speeches by Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke, and the extent to which they used the words equilibrium was so striking, I decided to put in one of those word clouds. And I think equilibrium was about the 7th and the 9th most common word, apart from the, of, and if in the document. So it's a totally dominant concept in their thinking. And I had a fourth meta-axiom to the ones that Yanis and Christian put forward, and that is methodological barter. Fundamentally, the monetary system is seen as just an aid to barter, and you can safely neglect it, except for the times that you can't. Unfortunately, that happens to be now, but okay. So the recent history of macro, looking from the 1970s CGE through to 1990s, 2000s DSGE, has been dominated by what I would call the subjugation of macro to micro. Okay? There's really isn't a case of integration, it's subjugation. Macro these days is applied microeconomics. And when you look at why it was done, you find plenty of, this is the beautiful thing about the modern era, you can find the literature trail that shows where these came from. This is a speech, I think, by Lucas when he was president of the American Economic Association, saying nobody was satisfied with ISLM as the end of macroeconomic theorising. The idea was we were going to tie it together with microeconomics, and that was the job of our generation. That was what is seen as a necessary thing to do. Now, there's two wings to this. I called it a dialectical tension in a Marxist fashion, but I realise rather like a bad marriage in a more modern fashion. You know, a couple that can't stand each other and can't live without each other. So one extreme you have the new classicals. I'd say they're the males in this relationship, who developed the core tools, which are the whole idea of real business cycle models and stuff like that. They derived from Ramsey's growth model back in the 1920s. And then on the other side, the more feminine side, the new Keynesians say, well, listen, dear, that just isn't realistic. Let's add some, other things we understand from our toolkit, like imperfect competition to explain why prices take a while to adjust. We can use search theory to explain why there's lagged responses to changes rather than instantaneous changes. They hate each other, but of course they produce a relationship which is neoclassical economics. Now, by the mid-2000s, there was a real sense of triumphalism to how the neoclassicals described their vision of the world and their accuracy in capturing what they saw as the essential features of capitalism. This is Lucas, again, from that speech in 2003. He said, macroeconomics was born as a distinct field in the 1940s. Interesting, because Keynes did most of the work in the 1930s, but still. As part of the response to the Great Depression. He said, the term then referred to the body of knowledge and expertise that we hope would prevent the recurrence of that economic disaster. Oh, by the way, one way in which he is correct, he's talking about America in the 1940s and early 50s with Samuelson. That is accurate. So the body of knowledge that would prevent the recurrence of that economic disaster. Said, my thesis in this lecture is the macroeconomics in its original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes, as in fact been solved for many decades. What's that old saying about pride goeth before the fall? Now, Bernanke, similarly, in 2004, and I found speeches right up to including 2007 with a similar nature to them, saying that the low inflation era of the past 2 decades has seen a marked reduction in volatility, which we've dubbed the Great Moderation. And of course, he took credit for it, saying that the sources of where it came from are controversial, but there's evidence that improved control of inflation, which of course they see as the responsibility of the central bank, which he was then part of, has contributed to this welcome change to the economy. And Blanchard, now I find this probably the most remarkable of all. Olivier Blanchard is slowly going through what looks like a long-distance mea culpa, apologising for his previous views. But I still find it stunning. The date on this paper is August 2008. Now the crisis is dated to having started in August 2007. So this is a year into the crisis. And he states in this that, talking about the husband-wife squabbles between new Keynesians and neoclassicals, for a long time the explosion that made the field look like a battlefield, he said, over time, largely because facts do not go away, he was already in the middle of a totally contradictory fact, but nonetheless, facts don't go away, a largely shared vision has emerged. The state of macro is good. 1 year after the crisis began, 8 months after the Federal Reserve and the BEA declared that this recession had begun. So that's neoclassical. What's post-Keynesian? That's the field I'm most identified with, though I'm certainly not in the mainstream of post-Keynesian economics. I work in what's called complexity theory. But this is Diane Coyle, who's one of the authors of the core curriculum, which is an attempt to derive an economics which is, they state, teaching economics as if the last 30 years has happened. What it actually, the real meaning is teaching economics as if the last 30 years of neoclassical economic research have happened. Okay? Because it really doesn't have much of anything else than neoclassical inside there. Now, she was talking on the BBC radio program, Teaching Economics After the Crash, which was done by Aditya Chakraborty, who's the economics correspondent for The Guardian. And in response to a comment from the post-crash society, which is very much like the Rethinking Economics group here. And by the way, I applaud you on this conference and the professionalism with which you put it together. It's really quite fantastic. He said, post-crash has this fixation on schools of thought. He said, this idea that there's a monolithic neoclassical school that's dominated economic thought for the curriculum for a long time, that needs to switch to different schools, heterodox, etc., etc. I think that's going backwards, she said. That's going back to the economics of the 1930s and these almost medieval scholastic debates about what your worldview was. Now, I'd heard her say that before we ended up having a debate with her, myself, and a physicist a PhD in physics, George Cooper, who now worked in Goldman Sachs for a while, so he knows his maths and he also knows the inside of the bowel of the financial beast. And George and I were on the same side debating with Diane, as it turned out. And again, she's asked a question from the students in the audience, what about teaching post-Keynesian? And she said, I find it quite bizarre that there's a lot of reaching back to 70 or 100-year-old historical ways of thinking about the economy when the economy has changed so much. Now, I was sitting on stage at that point, and my reaction was to say, well, last time I checked, I'm only 60. But what's, again, the perception that she has, and this is common amongst neoclassical economists, is that post-Keynesian means what Keynes wrote for breakfast after he wrote the general theory. That's 80 years out of date. No, it's an alternative and I think realism-oriented approach to economics. It's got its own flaws. I'm critical of it in many ways, but nowhere near as much as I am of neoclassical economics, but there's lots to be fixed up. And it really began as a breakaway from the mainstream when John Hicks developed the ISLM interpretation of Keynes. Now, most people don't know this, and I'm trying to get various neoclassicals to read it, but Hicks himself ultimately declared himself to be a post-Keynesian. He broke away from the mainstream, and notice the journal in which this paper was published, which is why most neoclassicals don't know it exists. In 1981, he wrote a paper called ISLM, An Explanation, and published it in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, because largely debates with the founder of the journal, Paul Davidson, led him to reconsider the model and decide it was useless. And I think it should be actually titled ISLM, An Apology, if you read it. Please do read it. Now, the post-Keynesian school has a structural approach to economic modelling. Rather than starting with a set of a priori notions about people's behaviour, it's talking about the structure of the economy and how that largely determines what happens in the economy. And it's also a bit of a chameleon. If you look back in the 1960s and 1970s, it was all input-output matrices, vertical models of production, Koleskian growth cycles, etc., etc. Now it's dominated by what's called stock flow consistent modelling and also endogenous money. I'm a major contributor to the second, a partial contributor to the former. And it has a set of meta-axioms as well. And the first is that realism should drive modelling. Don't make unrealistic assumptions. Okay? And when neoclassicals say assumptions don't matter, what they're really saying is keep your hands off our assumptions. Okay? They don't want them challenged. So, for example, uncertainty cannot be equated to risk and is an essential feature of reality. So a major part of the philosophical discussion is how does one handle uncertainty? What does that actually mean? And how do you bring it into modelling as well? Models of production are structural. You start from saying you need factories to produce output and start working in that sequential way. Work in terms of social classes rather than individualism. And this has been justified by, of all things, a leading theorem in neoclassical economics, known as the SMD theorem after the initials of its people who rediscovered it in the 1970s, Sonnenschein, Mantel, de Breu. But it shows you can't get a downward sloping market demand curve when you have heterogeneous agents and heterogeneous commodities. Complexity rather than equilibrium. So rather than saying the economy is in equilibrium, it's normally far from equilibrium. Like any dynamic system under external pressure, it'll be away from equilibrium and never will approach its equilibrium values, and it's fundamentally monetary. And those last two aspects are the major ones I'll talk about today. But it also has a very strong history of critiquing neoclassical economics, and neoclassical economics has an equally strong history of ignoring the critiques. But let's take a look at some of them. Back in the 1960s, Piero Sraffa reasoned that you could only actually add up the amount of capital by reducing capital to dated labour. And when you did that, you got a highly non-linear relationship between the rate of profit and the amount of capital that you measured you had using this dated labour technique. And what it meant was the neoclassical theory argues that the rate of profit depends upon the amount of capital, marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Instead, what Sraffa showed is the measured amount of capital was a function of the rate of profit in a very non-linear way. So you couldn't argue that profit was a return to the capital's return in the same way that you get the idea that workers get their marginal product. It had to be a surplus. And Samuelson actually conceded defeat in that debate. This is one thing which again annoys me immensely about neoclassicals who, if they even have heard of the Cambridge debate, and most of them haven't, think they won it. Well, Samuelson was on the conservative side, And this is how he summed it up in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. If all this causes headaches for those nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical writing, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. Well, they haven't, and he didn't really either, but at least he admitted it in one paper. There's also another area that's unknown to most neoclassical economists. The general equilibrium models always tend to be unstable, and it's tended to be a mathematical property of matrices that explains why. Because production involves positive or zero amounts of other commodities, you have a positive semi-definite matrix, meaning that all entries are either equal to or greater than zero in your input-output matrix, and you therefore get an unstable system either in prices or in quantity, because they both depend upon the matrix and the inverse of the same matrix. And if I mentioned the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem again, if you have individuals, all of whom have precisely neoclassical consumption functions from which you could derive precisely neoclassical downward sloping demand curves, the market demand curve you get out of that can have any polynomial shape at all. Now, that does not mean that in the real world demand curves are polynomial, which is how I've seen some neoclassicals react to this criticism. It's simply saying neoclassical economics does not have a theory to explain one of its central concepts, which is downward sloping market demand curves. They don't have an explanation. Something left out of the model has to explain it, and my candidate would be income distribution, which they don't include as an argument in the nature of demand setting. And I've written my own critique of perfect competition, which is neither perfect nor indeed able to exist, but it still dominates how neoclassicals think. So I see economics, in that sense, neoclassical economics, as an anti-mathematical discipline. A lot of people think that critics of neoclassical economics are anti-mathematical. No, I think neoclassical economics is anti-mathematical. Because if you had a mathematical response to these various critiques, for a start with Schraffer, that would have been the end of the idea of using marginal productivity theory to explain income distribution. You wouldn't have to wait 50 years for Piketty to do it instead. Profit would instead be seen as a surplus, which is the way the classical school treated it. Methodological individualism would be out the window, and equilibrium as well, because since you have non-equilibrium dynamics as an essential part of an input-output system, price formation has to also be non-equilibrium. You can work with the abstraction of a single commodity at various times, but when you go multi-sectoral, it's necessarily non-equilibrium. Individualism has to go because you can't aggregate from individual behaviour, which fits neoclassical rules, to collective behaviour that fits those same rules. And I see this as being, if this had been how the Pythagoreans reacted to finding out that the square root of 5 was an irrational number, we would still be sitting on marble seats, and I wouldn't be using a microphone. So this would have, in other words, mathematical discovery should have transformed neoclassical economics into something much richer. But instead the reaction has been to ignore the lot. They still use marginal productivity theorem in a rather altered form, but it's still there. They still assume equilibrium in a DSGE form, and they have this travesty of the representative agent. And even when they have heterogeneous agents, they normally whack workers and capitalists together and have them differing on how patient they are and things like that, rather than class basis of income and so on. So I see it as a fundamentally anti-mathematical school. And I describe what they do as being driven by a set of preordained beliefs, a teleology, a telos as the Greeks call it, that dominates the development rather than being driven by mathematics. And what they practice is not mathematics, it's mythematics. It's also anti-empirical. Now again, whenever neoclassical economics gets a challenge, it retreats back into micro. And we're starting to see that right now, okay? Because macro, they put a macro theory together, the economy explodes, something's wrong with macro, let's retreat back to micro again, they regroup. It's a bit like a groundhog going into the ground and coming back up when the sun comes up again. So they have this utility maximizing explanation of behavior. Well, it's been very carefully tested in a brilliant paper from 1997, published in the Economic Journal, not a post-Keynesian journal this time, but a mainstream journal. Beautiful, very, very careful test. And at the end of it, the conclusion of the researcher was that he found a considerable number of violations of revealed preference, contradicting the neoclassical theory of the consumer maximising utility subject to a budget constraint. And given that we should pay limits, realise the limits of using this as a way of describing human behaviour, and certainly be less imperialist in our ambitions. anything but that has happened. The paper's been ignored. Similarly, you get this idea of firms facing rising or marginal cost. I might use a technical term here and say that empirically that's bullshit. There's over 100 empirical studies that have been done since the 1930s. Every last one of them has found that between 89 and 95% of firms report constant or falling marginal cost. Now again, mainly this has been done by people outside the mainstream. So I was delighted to find in the late 1990s that Alan Blinder, who was at various times had been deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve, deputy president of the American Economic Association, so absolutely mainstream, again did a very careful study, hiring PhD students to be his questioners and interviewing firms in the northeast quadrant of the United States that, when he worked it out, represented 15% of America's GDP. So it's a serious sample. And here's his conclusion. The overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory is that apparently only 11% of GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost. Firms report having very high fixed costs, roughly 40% of the average total, which again is not conventional belief. And many more companies have falling rather than rising marginal cost curves. So now, while the reasons he said maybe he tried to find reasons that you might justify, but he had PhD students posing the questions, interpreting the answers. Okay, face-to-face interviews. It wasn't a case of what people might click in a survey box and not really understand the concept. They had a PhD student in economics there to explain any things they weren't sure about. So their answers paint an image of the cost structure of the typical firm that is very different than one immortalized in textbooks. So it's not empirical. It ignores empirical data that contradicts the basic notions of the discipline. You will not find that reference in any neoclassical text. And also, if it were true, think about this. If it were true that there was some profit maximizing level of output, then a job with the sales manager would ring up the sales team and say, stop selling, we've reached maximum profit. Any more sales now will reduce our profit. No one has or ever will make that phone call. Okay? It's a myth. There is no profit maximizing level. That's why sales managers' job is to get as many sales as possible. It's nonsense to say we can restrict it internally there. And just to give you an idea of how much this is neglected, by the way, this is looking in Amazon. This is the book I'm talking about, asking about prices. I have a copy. It may be the only one ever sold. Because notice there's only one customer review. He gave him 5 stars, which is pretty good. Of course, I wrote the review. Here at the same time is Microeconomic Theory, Mas-Kalel's book. Now, I'll give Mas-Kalel some credit here. You can find almost every flaw in economic theory inside that book. He admits the Sonnenschein-Mandelbrot critique. It's just that I'm sure the teachers, when they scram over that almost 1,000-page book, ignore those particular sections or gloss over them or use the mathematical exercises rather than saying anything goes, as one of the subheadings does. This has 98 customer reviews. The sales level for this book, even today, in terms of Amazon, it's running at about 121,000 right now. Where is Alan's book? I think it's in the millions, 1.6, 1.7 millionth sales level. Of course, yeah, 1.643 millionth in the bestseller list in Amazon. In other words, nobody buys it. Okay? So they ignore even empirical research, even when it's done by one of their own. So the crisis in 2008 had every reason to be not just a crisis for the economy, but also a crisis for economic theory. And of course, it was completely unanticipated by the mainstream DSGE models. My favourite here being the OECD, that in June of 2007 published this is the overview to their bi-yearly report. Our central forecast remains indeed quite benign. A soft landing in the United States, a strong and sustained recovery in Europe, yeah. Sustained growth with strong job creation and falling unemployment. Now, think about it. This is what politicians received as advice in June of 2007. And 2 months later, all hell starts to break loose. Now, after the crisis, they have pretty much 3 defences. The first, and this is the commonest one I cop, crises can't be predicted. They're exogenous shocks. You can't predict the size or scale of when the shock's going to come. Don't blame us for not seeing it coming. Secondly, they will admit sometimes that 99% of the models are linear. which means that you can have what's called superposition. So if you double something, it has double the impact. You don't double something, it has 5 times the impact. And you can separate out one cause from another. So, well, non-linear models don't have the problem, but they're too complicated. And the third is, well, linear models are okay if we can, I'm here quoting Olivier Blanchard from about maybe 2 or 3 months ago, stay away from dark corners. Okay. That's his advice. Our models are fine so long as you don't get into trouble. In other words, we can tell you how to drive a car so long as you don't get into a skid. Okay. Now, my response to those is, first of all, the failure was due to the a priori notions the theory has that leave out the most important variables in the economy. When you include them, it's obvious that the crisis was going to happen, and in fact, economists were the least well informed about the likelihood of crises. Many people with a gut feeling and worries about the level of leverage they saw in society, their premonitions were far more accurate than economic theory. In fact, the opposite. Economic theory distracted people from seeing these premonitions, so don't worry about them. Secondly, it isn't true that nonlinear models are too complicated. The whole idea of complexity is that a simple model can give you complicated behaviour or complex behaviour, but you can learn a lot from those very, very simple models, and I'll give you an example shortly. And the third is, we are still in that dark corner. Okay. Neoclassical economics can't even tell you whether you're there or not because it doesn't know what causes dark corners. Okay. It's only good advice if you can tell us how they happen. They can't do that. So you've got to know how they're created, and they don't have an idea of it. So what's their explanation for the crisis? Well, they haven't got one for this yet, but give it 30 or 40 years and somebody called Ben Bernanke, Mark II, will come along and say something like Ben Bernanke, Mark I, said about the Great Depression. And this is from his book Essays on the Great Depression. There is now overwhelming evidence that the main factor depressing aggregate demand was a worldwide contraction in world money supplies, which I agree with. Monetary data is quite remarkable and tend to underscore the stinging critique of the Fed's policies. Now I'm starting to disagree, because he's blaming the Fed for causing the crisis. It was also beautiful justice, I thought, that he became Fed chairman. Okay. Now, in another talk, he's giving a talk at the 90th birthday of Milton Friedman, and he ended up by saying, "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I'd like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it. We're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again." Whoops. And he's in the chair at the time, of course. So without warning, I got that in inverted commas deliberately, the economy collapsed after the Great Moderation. So if you chart inflation and unemployment, which are the two indicators they're looking at, you have this wonderful period of diminishing cycles. Each peak, as you notice in unemployment, is lower than the previous peak. Inflation's also trending down, then bang, the crisis hits, unemployment rockets up, and inflation temporarily becomes deflation before the huge rescue efforts pumped in, then trending back down again, of course, which is now getting close to zero, if not already zero in America. So why didn't they see it coming? What were they missing? Well, there's a set of false priors that really they demonstrate. The first is money doesn't matter. The fundamental, and this is why I say it's a methodological barter, is an essential part of neoclassical economics. According to the core theory, money should not cause real disturbances. Money should only cause monetary disturbances. And that was part of micro, but it wasn't part of macro until we got Lucas critique coming along, so-called Lucas critique. So with micro, you were told this idea of money illusion. If you work out somebody's preference, show them preferences and difference curves, that stuff that I've shown doesn't empirically work, but who cares? Let's use it anyway. You use the indifference curves to describe preferences. You whack a budget line on top of that. You then tell students double all prices and double incomes. What happens? Nothing, sir. Okay, therefore, anybody who thinks money matters is suffering from money illusion. Now it's embedded in macro right from the outset. And again, if you go back to look at Lucas and Sargent, where these ideas came from, I think this is Lucas writing saying that if you look at the cyclical correlation between real output and prices, so this is a relationship. You imagine there's a volatile demand curve with a relatively stable upward sloping supply curve. But he said this point is a paradox because assuming the absence of money illusion, so the micro concept is in there straight away, that implies a vertical supply curve. So therefore the puzzle is, how do monetary fluctuations lead to real outcomes? Because according to the theory, demand fluctuations of a purely nominal nature should lead to price fluctuations only. So it's embedded right in the ground that this stuff should just cause price changes. Monetary disturbances, the monetary system, should only cause ups and downs in the rate of inflation. It shouldn't really affect real output like it manifestly did in 2008. The second false prize related to this, and that is that debt doesn't matter. Private debt doesn't matter. They obsess about government debt, the wrong one, and they ignore private debt. Now, the reason for this, I'll show you a couple of examples of why. Bernanke, again, from his essays, effectively dismissing Irving Fisher, who had what he called the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. He tried to rework Fisher into a more neoclassical guise, but fundamentally he rejected Fisher's argument. And he said the idea goes back to Fisher about a dynamic process with falling asset and commodity prices, creating pressure on nominal debtors, forcing him into distressed sales, further price declines, etc., etc. He admitted it affected Roosevelt, but he said Fisher's idea was less influential in academic circles because of the counter-argument that debt deflation represented no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. Now, take a good look at that. I hope you're realistic enough to realise there's something wrong there. Even if it were right that it's a redistribution, the whole thing about people going bankrupt is they do not pay their debts. Okay? You can still make a statement like that and not realise the unreality of it. He said, absent and plausibly large differences in spending propensities, pure redistributions, which is how debt is seen, a saver lends to a borrower, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. So he didn't even analyse empirically, and the data was there, Fisher's argument. And it's maintained today, even after we've had a crisis, which people, even neoclassical economists, have to say debt played a role in this. The reason is they have what's called the loanable funds model of lending, and this is quoting from Paul Krugman now. So think of it this way, when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. So what he's alleging there is that there's no relationship between a change in the level of debt and a change in the level of the money supply. Okay? Changing debt does not change money supply. It's rather a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. So what's argued there is that the spending power of which falls in one case is offset by an increase in the other. And again, it's the whole idea that there's only a peripheral impact. And he used this argument to critique Richard Koo as somebody who I agree with in his analysis of the economy largely. And Richard argues that the economy can be completely balance sheet constrained. And Krugman is saying this makes no sense. Because when there are debtors, there must also be creditors. So there must be some people who can respond to lower real interest rates even in a balance sheet recession. So he's ruling out this whole argument because on the basis that savers and borrowers offset each other and changes in the level of debt don't really matter. Well, I've built a software package designed for monetary modelling called Minsky, and you can download it by clicking on that link there. It takes you to SourceForge here, and you can download it. It's an open source program. It's a long way to go, but I can illustrate some interesting points with it. So what I've did using Minsky in this model I'm about to show you is I took the so-called model of banking that's in the appendix to a paper by Egertzing and Krugman, which has a patient consumer agent lending to an impatient investment agent, meaning that one produces consumer goods, the other produces investment goods. And the investment agent, of course, pays interest, but the bank charges an intermediation fee because the bank arranged the loan. Didn't do any lending, it just enabled the consumer to lend to the investor. And of course, what I now do, I deviate from neoclassical mainstream quite happily here, without representative agents and all that nonsense. So what I instead have, I treat them both as industrial sectors, both hiring workers, both buying output from each other, both selling to workers in the bank and each other. The investment agent has to pay what I have in the model is there's set rates of repayment, which then you can modify and vary and see what happens. So I change those borrowing and repayment rates and see what happens. And the answer is that if this is institutionally accurate as a description of lending, they're right. Debt doesn't matter. And I'll show you. This is the basic model here. So I have a bank arranging a loan, charging a fee for it, workers get hired, outputs get sold, etc., etc. And the way Minsky works is you represent financial transactions in a double-entry bookkeeping format. Any accountants in the room? No? Well, a couple, okay. Pretty rare. So what I've got, I'm following accounting conventions here. So assets are shown as positive, liabilities and equity are shown as negative. All rows sum to zero, including the initial conditions, and the flow is from positive to negative, because adding a positive sum to a negative amount reduces it. So the liability of the bank goes down to consumer, goes up to the investment sector because of the lending. And debt's not there, you might notice. I've got, just to show what's happening, I have the consumer agent lends to the investment agent agent repays the debt, the investment agent pays interest, the consumer agent pays a fee to the bank, the consumer agent hires workers, the investment agent hires workers, the investment sector buys consumer goods, the consumer goods sector buys investment goods, workers consume, and bankers consume, and bankers invest. Follow that? It's not too hard. That's why I've designed this system rather than the flowchart software that dominates system dynamics, as I'll show you in a moment. So debt doesn't appear there because it's an asset of the consumer sector, and this is only showing assets of the bank. So you've got to do another table, which Minsky generates, showing it from the point of view of the consumer agent. And now what's happening here is the consumer deposit at the bank is now shown as a positive sum because it's an asset of the consumer sector, and the debt is shown as a positive sum because debt is an asset of the consumer sector, the debt the investment sector owes to it. So lending reduces the amount of cash inside the consumer agent's bank account, but increases the asset they have in forms of debt with the investment sector. And of course the consumer sector has to do without cash in the meantime, so likely to spend less. Put it all together, and this is now the combined flowchart and double entry bookkeeping vision of Minsky, but I'll now bring it up on a large scale here, and I'm going to run the model and show you what happens to the level of economic growth, which is here. And I've also unfortunately clicked, this is beta software, sometimes too sensitive. I actually added an extra element there by accident. I'll just get rid of that before it causes any trouble. Okay, we have the economy growing on. Now I'm going to notice it's all flatline. Growth is 0. There's no change in the money stock. There's the level of money stock. Level of debt's risen up to the stage where debt now exceeds the money stock, which is quite feasible. It's been running for 172 years so far. So I'm just going to speed up the lending and slow down repayment. And notice you now have a dramatic increase in the level of debt. If the screen was big enough to show you the debt to GDP ratio, I could show you that as well. That'd be rising quite dramatically. Keep that going for a while. Still not much change to the level of debt. Let's now have a dramatic decline in the level of debt. So repayment happens much more rapidly and lending occurs much more slowly. I think I actually did stuff it up by bringing that extra element in there. So I'll start again. Hang on, let's see. Pardon me. One reason Bill Gates never does demonstrations live. Okay, let's try again and see if it sets properly. Okay, now I'm going to have, so an increase in the lending rate. There we go. Notice the debt level's risen rapidly. And now also a reduction in the rate of repayment. Notice an explosion in the level of debt. What's happened to growth? Technically speaking, bugger all. Okay, no change in the rate of GDP growth. It's still pretty much 0. You then might have a rapid increase in the rate at which people repay their debts and a decline in the rate of lending. A couple of little blips there to the growth rate. And now debt's fallen dramatically. But overall, not much has happened. You can see just over in the corner here, this is GDP, which has been, for 250 years, has been running at an average roughly 200, ups and downs, but no particular change. So that's showing the argument that making these dramatic changes to the level of debt really has little impact upon the economy, unless you hit the 0 lower bound, etc., which I didn't model there. So why doesn't debt matter? Well, I'm going to take a look at it. This is going to push the brain cells a bit. I'm sorry about that, but we'll see how you cope. Consider a three-sector model of the economy. I'm not going to say what the sectors are, just labeling S1, S2, and S3. Expenditure that's not financed by debt, I'm going to show in capital letters. This is therefore spending you do using your current amount of money, wherever the money may have come from. Whereas debt finance expenditure I'll show with lowercase letters. So if you borrow money from anywhere, another agent or from a bank, it'll be shown in lowercase. And I'm going to look at three situations. One where you can't borrow at all. One where you can borrow but only from other sectors, which is loanable funds. And the third where you can borrow from a bank, which is the endogenous money case. Now, the first case you might call Say's law, but in fact, rather than supply creates its own demand, its demand creates its own supply. And if I put this table together, the horizontal elements are the spending and the diagonal elements of the spending, and the off diagonals are the recipients of that spending. So the negative sum is aggregate demand. Okay. And the sum of the off diagonal elements is aggregate income. So it shows the equality of the two. Now you look at the two, you can tell obviously that aggregate expenditure is identical to aggregate income in that situation. That's nothing remarkable. So if you do use a symbolic logic program to add up the columns, that's what it'll give you, or the elements. Now loanable funds, I'm going to have sector 1 borrowing A plus B from sector 2 and then spending A plus B on sector 2 and 3. And I could make them different, but it's easier just to stick with the same letters. So sector 1's funds for spending rise by A plus B, while sector 2's fall by A plus B. So when you put that together, you now have terms in the change in debt turning up as part of the argument, but they cancel out. What about a bank lending? Well, a bank lends by creating an asset on one side of its book and a liability on the other. And what we're looking at here is the liability accounts of the banking sector. That's what deposits actually are. So the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector rise equally, and the increases the spending power of sector 1 without reducing the spending power of any other sector. So let's put the mathematics there. What I now have, you notice the A plus B is on this row, but it's not on the next row because the money's being created by the bank lending. So you do your sums and you find the change in debt turns up at both aggregate demand and aggregate income. So the aggregate outcome for both income and expenditure is greater than if there were no borrowing. And equally, if that's a negative, if people are paying their debts down, it's smaller. So changes in the level of debt cause an equal instantaneous change in expenditure and income. And I can actually show that by modifying the model, because I can go back to that model now. Let's hope I don't stuff this up. It's so easy to make a mistake when you do these things live. But this is the consumer sector's account. And as you can see, I hope you can see on the screen, there's D for debt as an asset of the consumer sector. Now in Minsky, I can say, well, let's just delete that column because that's nonsense. There is some lending like that, but most lending is by banks to non-banks. So I'm going to delete that column, and then the lending and repayment and interest payment and also this idea of a bank fee also are fictions, so I'm going to get rid of those. I might push my luck and try to fix up one more element here and say that the actual, let's see, don't want to make typing mistakes when I do that. Okay, that's saying that the assets are less for the consumer sector. Come to the banking sector, and I can now, I'll just expand this so you can see it on the screen. Notice I've got these unbalanced operations over here. What the program is doing is making sure that all rows sum to 0, so it's warning me this one doesn't yet. So I'm going to click here and create a new asset column. And the program remembers that debt's still in the system because it's still shown as a liability of the investment sector. So I choose that, and instantly 2 of those rows are corrected for me. I'm going to delete the bank fee and say that the interest is actually paid to the bank rather than paid to the consumer sector. A few more changes I should make, but I'll leave it at that. Hang on, come on, react. Good, okay. Now let's reset the system and see what happens. I haven't made the complete changes. There's 2 more I should make, but I'll try it now. Okay, let's try that again. Starting with the lending rates at the same rate as I began the other model. So 7 years to double lending and 9 years to double repayment. Okay, off we go. Notice we have a positive rate of growth. That didn't happen in the other model. Notice also the level of money is changing as the level of debt rises. Now if I have an increase in the rate of lending and a decrease in the rate of repayment, notice the growth rate rises. If, on the other hand, we have what happened in 2007, and there's a sudden increase in the rate of repayment and a slowdown in the rate of lending, then the growth rate plunges and goes negative, and the level of money falls in the economy. That's all it takes to go from loanable funds to endogenous money. It's simply admitting the institutional reality that banks lend money and saying what are the macroeconomic consequences of that. That's all it takes. Now, that's what they leave out. And if you admit that, you're admitting one of the biggest variables in capitalism. It's no wonder you don't see crises coming when you leave something like that out. And that's why the crisis was predictable. not the timing of it, but the fact that it had to happen because the level of the rate of growth was enormous. Now, again, one thing that neoclassicals often throw at critics is you just don't know enough mathematics. Yeah, that's the equations for the loanable funds. That's the equations for endogenous money. They're just showing you there are equations behind this stuff, okay? And all that's happened really is that these terms, repayment and lending and the fee, have disappeared from the consumer deposits argument, and the interest payment has moved over to the banking. So it's not a large structural change, but it's a huge change in the nature of the world. And realism is an essential part of seeing that. And the Bank of England has finally chimed in here, much to their credit, on the endogenous money side, with a wonderful set of papers and videos published last year, beginning of last year, called Money Creation in the Modern Economy. I highly recommend taking a look at it. They're saying banks create money when they lend, and it's therefore a major part of macroeconomics, which is still not part of how neoclassicals think. Now, this is slightly more intimidating. I want to show that the result I showed you about the change in debt transfers across from the single instant lend thing I was showing beforehand to looking at an overall flow. So this is looking at now treating each of those S1, S2, S3, the sectors, as amounts in a bank account. And I've now got the change in debt turning up here as a flow of debt, an annual flow of debt. And this is the change in debt is dimensioned by years. Rate of change of debt per year is the term there. And you also get interest payments turning up as well because you've now got a bank inside the system. So the aggregate definition for demand now is that demand is equal to the turnover of existing money plus gross financial transactions plus the change in debt. And that's the vision that I've got of how I want you to look at the monetary macroeconomics. So both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income are non-debt financed expenditure, which comes out of the turnover of existing money, which is all neoclassicals have in their models, if they have models of the monetary system at all, plus the change in debt, which both creates new money and demand at the same time because you borrow to spend, plus gross financial transactions. And that gives me what I'm calling a dynamic non-equilibrium version of the quantity theory of money. Because Milton Friedman used to argue that you could say prices times output was equal to the velocity of circulation times the amount of money. That was Friedman. When you look at it properly, it's got to also include new debt. So it's a dynamic version of that equation. And when you look at the rate of change in aggregate demand, you get the acceleration of debt turning up as well as the level of debt. So these are the factors I was looking at before I'd worked out all the mathematics properly, but with the intuition right that these things mattered, that made me aware a crisis is going to happen when I look at the data for the first time in a long time in December of 2005. So that's the huge emitted variable in mainstream economics. It's no wonder it didn't see the crisis coming. Leave that out, there can be no crisis, fundamentally. So it's not unpredictable, it's ignored. And this is the type of thing which happens in neoclassical economics all the time, because a priori reasoning, rather than empirical logic, rules how they put the model together. So if you look at their thinking again, their argument was, well, aggregate income is identical to aggregate expenditure, and therefore change in debt only redistributes. What I'm saying is, from a monetary post-Keynesian point of view, aggregate income is identical to aggregate expenditure, and given endogenous money, the two are equal to expenditure and income out of current money, plus expenditure and income generated by the change in debt. And therefore a slowdown in the rate of growth of debt can cause a crisis. And that's why I anticipated one and why I called it when it did, because the change in debt itself is such a huge part of demand given the level of debt we have now that simply a slowdown in its rate of growth is enough to cause a recession. And when you get it becoming negative, which of course it can be, then you get a depression. So looking at the data back in 2005, I realized that the level, first of all, was far too high. It was the highest. I had data going back to 1952 at that point. It was the highest level of debt since 1952. I didn't know how it related to the Great Depression level, but it was certainly the highest in the post-war period. Its rate of change was also the highest in the post-war period. It simply couldn't be sustained. When it slowed down, there was going to be a crisis, and given that there had been nothing of the scale since 1952, I guessed that it would be a depression scale event, something beyond anything we'd seen in the post-war period. So you can use the dynamics of debt to explain both the Great Depression, which Bernanke didn't, and the Great Recession. And to give you an idea of looking at aggregate data, I've put this data together over the last few years by taking current time series and then latching them onto earlier time series and adjusting them so that they meet at the same level, which is the type of stuff that Reinhardt and Rogoff did in their good empirical work. Not the crap they put out that they got criticised by Thomas Hendren for, but when they did good work on long-term data series, that's what they did too. So this is looking, the red line is private debt in America. That's a proportion of GDP going back to 1834. The blue line is government debt. Now this pattern's repeated over the planet because despite the obsession that neoclassicals have with the level of government debt, private debt is in almost every country far higher than government debt. Okay? That on the reason alone, you should be looking at it. Now, using similar arguments to mine, Wynne Godley started warning of a crisis back in 1998, using sectoral analysis and simply saying the sectoral flows are so dependent upon an ever-rising level of household debt. This has to stop. When it does, since the budget deficit won't grow by as much and the trade deficit won't fall enough to match it, there'll have to be a recession. So he began warning of one in 1998 and repeated and changed the argument, but because it just took so long to get there, I started making my warnings in late 2005, so say 2006, and notice what happened to the debt levels. Rose and then came down. The only time it's ever looked like that before is the Great Depression, various other booms and busts in the 19th century. So when you take a look at the rate of change, then you can explain the beginning of the crisis. This is looking now at the data from the 1920s, annual data, so it's not quite as smooth, as accurate rather, but you can see the negative correlation between the two. When the change in debt slows down, unemployment goes up. And that applies also during the Roosevelt recession, which I think we're going to experience a repeat of shortly. So the correlation is minus 0.78 between the two data series. Now most economists would salivate to get a correlation coefficient bigger than 0.3. Okay? Minus 0.78 is pretty cool, but it's not as good as this. That's the current data. That's from 1990 to now. And the correlation coefficient between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of private debt is minus 0.93. Now, I am hoarse today because I've got a cold, but I've gone hoarse over my last 10 years trying to get people to look at this. And no conventional economists, and actually quite a few post-Keynesians, have also failed to consider this data and look at it and say, there's something serious going on here. And Kahneman, in his book, Learning Fast and Slow, used the phrase of what he called theory-induced blindness. If your theory tells you something can't happen, you don't see it, even when somebody shows it to you. So that's serious. Equally serious looking at the acceleration of debt, because the deceleration is the main thing which gives you an indication the crisis is coming. So here's looking at the acceleration and the deceleration of debt over the period from 1990 to today. Correlation coefficient there, minus 0.88. You can see where the crisis began, and you can see where the rate of change, the acceleration of debt plunged as well. So we have to model money and debt dynamics out of equilibrium. If we're going to model capitalism, we've got to do all those things. And that comes to the second defence, and that is that it's too hard. Well, it's not. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. So I'm going to give you a foundation for bringing debt and money into macroeconomics. And this is working from another great and neglected economist called Richard Goodwin, who in 1967 built this very, very simple model of the economy. And he said that at the simplest level, capital determines output. There's some rough relationship between the two. Let's just make it a constant, see what happens. Output determines employment. Given how much output you want to produce, that's how many workers you have to hire. Employment determines the rate of change of wages. Wages determine profits. He's got a simple two-class system here. Profits determine investment, and investment's the rate of change of capital. Now that gives you go from capital, the rate of change of capital, that's closed your model. So putting it mathematically, you get, let's say output is capital divided by capital output ratio. And labour employed is output divided by labour productivity. Labour divided by the population gives you an employment rate. I'm using a simple linear Phillips curve in the first illustration I give you here. So the Phillips curve times the level of wages is the rate of change of wages. Wages times labour gives you the wage bill. Subtract that from output, you have profit. In the simple model that Goodwin built, all profit gets invested, and investment minus depreciation is the rate of change of the capital stock. Now, building that in Minsky with a few parameter values I'm stating here for anybody who wants to play with it later, you get a model that behaves like this. So quite a model. I'll slow it down a bit because it runs fairly rapidly. And what you get is a non-equilibrium system. The equilibrium is actually what they call marginally unstable. Pardon me, picking up unstable on my knees, I saw, because I've damaged my knee running recently. So you get cycles that repeat forever. So that's an initial model. Trying to find where my mouse has got to. There we go. Okay. So that's a starting point. Now, I added the realism back in 1992 when I first built the model I'm about to show you. The capitalists don't invest all their profits. They invest more during a boom and less during a slump. And they finance it by borrowing money. But initially I'm just going to bring it in and have investment also being a linear function of the rate of profit, and then ignoring the issue of money for the meantime, put in the parameters needed to run that, and what I get is again a cyclical model, exactly the same cycle. They're slightly steeper. But I add a bit more realism and say, well, when they want to invest more than profits, they borrow money from a bank. And the bank then charges interest. 2 more bits of realism. That means I've got to have an equation where profit is net of interest payments as well as wages, and the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And putting those parameters in here, the model I get has a rather different behaviour. And I'll just show it to you again. So it's exactly the same model as you seen a moment ago, just with a section down here added that includes paying interest on outstanding debt. And when you simulate this model, and this is why I say simple models give you deep insights, because when I finished this paper, when I wrote it first time, I ended with a rhetorical flourish inspired by the mathematical properties of this model. And I wrote it to model Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. But this was not part of Minsky's prediction. What happens, notice the size of the cycles in employment. They get smaller for a while. If you're looking at that, your inclination would be to believe, oh, the economy is getting less volatile. Notice wages share is cycling down. In this model, wages are the main determinant of cost of production. So if I had inflation in the model, and I'll show you that in a moment, inflation would be falling as well. You'd see a great moderation coming your way. Keep running it for a while, notice what happens. The cycles start to get bigger. Now that cannot happen in a linear model, let alone an equilibrium one. So I finish with a rhetorical flourish saying that a period of tranquility in a capitalist economy will be a lull before the storm. Well, I had no idea how realistic my model was going to become. But that's what actually happened. There's the declining volatility, then the increasing volatility, and there's the increasing debt level, private debt, and declining worker share of output, so rising inequality. So it's all tied together in one incredibly simple model. And that's without bringing any nonlinear behavioral functions inside there. When you do, you get more realism, and I'll show you that in a moment. But you look at the mathematics as well, and again people say, why mathematics? Robert Skidelsky, who's a colleague, a friend, and equally a critic of neoclassical economics, is against us having too much fun using equations. And I say, well, let's actually look at this verbally. Can you interpret the core equations here? And you can interpret them verbally. And the first one comes down to the employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of population growth and labour productivity growth. That's a truism. That will happen. It's a factual statement. The second one says the wages share of output will rise if wage demands exceed the rate of growth of labour productivity. That is also a factual statement. And the third one I added there is the private debt to GDP ratio will rise if the rate of growth of debt exceeds the rate of economic growth. That is also a fact. Simple truisms. What you see when you put them together in the mathematical model is those complex results which forewarn of a crisis. So you need the mathematics as well. Those 3 statements alone wouldn't let you know what was going to happen. You've got to put it in a system which can simulate it, which is what complex systems is all about. So here's the model now shown in 3D. What was actually happening in those cycles beforehand is the behaviour you can see there. That's with nonlinear functions in it, so they're slightly more constrained than the ones I showed you in that simulation. Here's the American data. Much rougher, of course, but the basic trend is still there. Cyclical growth in the level of debt and ultimately a breakdown. Now, when you add a more realistic model, including prices in there, which I do, and government counter-cyclical policy, then you get something more complicated again. So I've embedded this in the presentation, of course, and I'll just bring it in here. This is a model which lets me switch from one situation to another. So if I start without government, without debt, and without prices in a linear model, then I get just the, oh, hang on, what have I got? I've got debt in there, pardon me, I didn't change the debt. Let's get rid of debt. Okay. So I get the straight cyclical model I showed you initially. If I go for nonlinear and include debt inside there, then I get the same basic dynamics I showed you in the first model of a collapse. Cycles in wage share, cycles in employment followed by a collapse. But much more extreme than we actually saw happening. If I include prices inside there, then you get the one-sided collapse we actually saw in the real world. That's rather too fast, I should slow it down a bit. But you get a series of cycles where employment cycles up and down, the cycles seem to be getting lower, you think the economy is doing wonderfully, and then without warning, it falls off a cliff. Now what about if you have a government sector? Well, the government can stabilise an unstable economy. That's part of Minsky's argument. And if I simulate this model where the government spending then comes in, then you can stabilise the model. But this is another reason why complex systems matter, because a politician looking at that would say, oh dear, the level of government debt's too high. The government debt is the black line here. It's exceeding 200% of GDP. Actually, what is it reaching though? Let's see. Government debt level, 110% of GDP. Obviously too high. Okay? So the obvious solution is to become less responsive to the level of unemployment. So let's actually make the unemployment rate you react to much lower. Tolerate a high level of unemployment, pardon me. A lower level of employment. I'll speed it up a bit. And oh dear, rising level of debt. Oh, we better be less responsive still. Oh dear, the economy has crashed. So complex systems teach you sometimes that doing something directly is not going to work. And my analogy here is driving a car. If you're an amateur driver, and I call myself an amateur driver, and I got into a skid going around a corner when I was turning left, my reflex would be to turn left harder. A professional driver who gets into a skid turns right, because the control of the skid going around the corner, you turn into the skid, not the direction you want to go. So what we've got is economists training neoclassical economists, training politicians to be amateur drivers of the economy, leading to us crashing it all the time with the fixation on austerity and so on. So those are the dangers of having the neoclassical theory dominating economics, which is why we need to learn more than neoclassical economics. It'd be far more technical because it'd actually use 20th and 21st century mathematics. The neoclassicals have invented a stylized version that still hangs back to the 19th century. But we need, in the meantime, to do what your student movement is calling for, which is to learn a wide range of schools of thought. There is no way that neoclassical economics deserves the one thing it criticises most in the economy, which is a monopoly. It's got a monopoly of thought now. It has shown it doesn't deserve it. In the meantime, let's learn a wide range of schools of thought. Let's reduce the amount of time wasted on micro. Let's do some empirical work instead. So economics has to grow up. It has to dump a fetish for the equilibrium, which I'm not going to call it a science because it's not. So I say all of the disciplines have abandoned equilibrium as a core piece of thinking. Use the far from equilibrium methods that are commonplace in genuine sciences these days. Dump methodological individualism. They've proven it doesn't work. What we have instead is complexity in emergent behaviour. And we've got the tools to handle that today. And dump the fantasy of barter as well. Capitalism is inherently monetary. We have to model it that way. And do use it using a stock flow consistent dynamic monetary work, which post-Keynes have pioneered but haven't perfected. So believe me, if there are neoclassicals out there with good technical skills and they can break themselves away from thinking in equilibrium terms and using optimizing agents and all that nonsense, they could actually help in improving the quality of the tools. But I'm also working with engineers and nuclear physicists, so I know it'll be done properly, just in case the other way goes. So it's all possible. All the simulation tools that I've shown you that I built there I was copying, in terms of the use of flowcharts to build the systems, software that's been around for 30 years. Extremely expensive, high-quality commercial software. There's multi-agent modelling as well that's feasible these days with a range of systems that exist. And big data is also now becoming part of the way we analyse a system. The data becomes the model in that sense. So that's what we should be doing. And if it's not being done at your university, come to join me at Kingston. Thank you. Welcome. I was going to save my presentation here before I forget. Pardon me. Okay, done.
Okay, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Okay. Happy to take questions, but we've been running out of time. Yeah.
Okay, יש לנו זמן לשתי שאלות, just 2 questions. אם למישהו יש.
Yeah, well, that's the history of economic thought is the essential thing there, and get somebody who actually understands history of economic thought to teach it. One of my good friends, Rod O'Donnell, who's a professor of economics at University of Technology in Sydney and an expert on Keynes, at a conference I went to, basically told neoclassicals, look, don't read Keynes. Okay? Please don't read Keynes, because you completely distort what he had to say. You see what you want to see in the words. If you want to get somebody teaching Keynes, call in somebody who actually studies history of economic thought. So hire some people who are historians of economic thought. Teach economic history again as well. Bring back that discipline. I was actually a junior academic at New South Wales University in the economics department there, where the economic historians pleaded to be able to leave the economics faculty and go to the arts faculty. Pleaded. And their plea was turned down. And their courses were made extinct. Okay, it died out. They wanted to get away because they didn't want to be dominated by the neoclassicals and told, you know, and made irrelevant. Instead, we lost economic history completely. History of economic thought, economic history, 2 vital things to add. I'd hire a mathematician. I emphasise hire a mathematician to teach complex systems as well. Put a technical subject inside there. Bloody challenging stuff, great fun, plenty of good software to use, cool graphics. Okay. But get those 3 taught. So I'd add those 3 courses as an essential start. No, I mean, probably the person doing most of the practical work, and there's actually an ex-banker called Richard Vague, who's written a book called The Next Economic Crisis. And he, because he's actually built 2 banks, 2 credit card companies, he knows what he's talking about in banking. So Richard's work at a very empirical level is probably the best that's around. Morris Schullerich and Taylor are doing some very good work on the scale of debt as well. In terms of the shadow banking system, there's an argument that the shadow bank doesn't create money, so it's not as essential. What it does is create huge leverage and huge gains, and it's a very effective way of parasiting money out of the real economy. I'm still not sure about how much impact it would have inside my system. I would need to have the shadow banking system creating money, in a sense, which on occasions it does, if people are willing to accept mutual transfers from mutual fund accounts as payment, etc., etc., then the money supply is expanded. If you change the rate at which people want trade terms out of things like that, if people accept certificates, etc., etc., then you are creating money like that. And it's a huge part of the asset bubbles we've seen. So I would see, I see no justification for the shadow banking system at anything like its current scale. Maybe 1/10, 1/20th its scale. It might have some fractional social value, but to let it get to the scale it has in the very first instance is a sign of the regulators, most of whom studied economics, not understanding the economy. So to me, it's the sheer scale of it that causes... I had a great little anecdote on that front. I met a person just recently who told me that he got tired of working in the banking sector, the sheer exhaustion, wanted to have more time for family and get away from the stress. So he resigned from being a banker and became a school teacher. And his first paycheck was 1/20th his paycheck in the bank. 1/20th. Now, that's meaning that the salary he got in the bank was over £500,000, okay? Because a school teacher gets about 25,000 or thereabouts. And that's parasitism, okay? And by the way, you realise he's working far harder as a school teacher than he ever did as a banker.
Thank you very much, פרופסור קין. תודה לכם שהגעתם לכאן. תודה רבה.